The mountain rises from the Tibetan plateau like a blade of stone thrust upward by forces older than memory, its fluted black rock catching the light in a way that makes even seasoned travelers fall silent. And from the moment it enters human awareness, it carries an aura not merely of height, but of presence, as though the land itself were watching. Because Mount Kailash is not introduced to history as a peak to be measured or conquered, but as an axis, a center, a still point around which the world turns. And long before maps or borders or empires, before the very idea of climbing mountains for glory existed, people spoke of this place in the language of origins, of gods and cosmic order, of creation itself taking shape in stone. And to understand why no one climbs it, one must first step into a time when mountains were not obstacles, but revelations, when geography and theology were inseparable, when the earth was believed to mirror the heavens, and certain places were thought to be the physical joints of the universe. And in that ancient worldview, Mount Kailash emerges not as a summit, but as the summit, the spiritual apex of the world, a natural form so symmetrical and imposing that it appears designed rather than eroded, its near-perfect pyramidal shape crowned with a cap of ice that gleams like polished silver against the dark rock, inspiring the earliest observers to see not randomness, but intention, not geology, but meaning. And so the story begins not with climbers or scientists, but with pilgrims, sages, and storytellers who stood at a distance and felt that approaching the mountain was already an act of devotion. In the oldest layers of Indian religious thought, preserved in Vedic hymns and later elaborated in the Puranas, Mount Kailash is identified as Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain, the axis mundi, around which the universe is structured, a towering pillar that connects the underworld, the earthly realm, and the heavens. And while modern scholars debate whether Kailash was originally conceived as Meru or later associated with it, the lived religious tradition leaves little doubt that for millions of Hindus, this mountain is the literal home of Shiva, the great ascetic god of destruction and regeneration, who sits upon its summit in eternal meditation, adorned with ash and serpents, his stillness holding the universe in balance. And in this conception, Kailash is not empty rock, but a divine residence, a place already occupied by a god whose presence sanctifies the land so completely that to step upon the peak would be an act of sacrilege, akin to trespassing into a sanctum meant only for the divine. The myths describe Shiva seated with his consort Parvati, surrounded by ganas and celestial beings, the mountain ringing with the sound of cosmic silence. And from this height, the rivers of life are said to flow, a belief that finds an uncanny echo in physical reality, because 4 of Asia's great rivers, the Indus, the Sutlej, the Brahmaputra, and the Karnali, have their sources in the region around Kailash, a hydrological coincidence that ancient peoples interpreted as further proof that this was the navel of the world, the place from which life-giving waters spread to nourish civilizations thousands of kilometers away, binding geography to theology in a way that made the mountain not only sacred, but essential. To the Buddhists who would later arrive on the plateau, Mount Kailash became Mount Kang Rinpoche, the precious jewel of snow, the abode of Demchok or Chakra Samvara, a wrathful yet compassionate deity representing supreme bliss. And in Tibetan Buddhism, the mountain is associated with the mandala, the sacred diagram of the universe, with Kailash at its center, a 3-dimensional embodiment of enlightenment itself. And here again, the summit is not a goal to be reached, but a reality to be contemplated, its power accessed not through ascent, but through circumambulation, the ritual walking of the Kora, a path around the mountain that mirrors the path of spiritual practice, where each step taken in humility is believed to erase lifetimes of negative karma, and to complete the circuit is to symbolically orbit the universe's heart, aligning oneself with cosmic order. Even older than Buddhism and Hinduism is the Bon tradition, the indigenous spiritual system of Tibet, which predates the arrival of Indian religious influences and regards Kailash as the seat of the sky goddess Sipai Men and the center of all existence, a 9-story swastika-shaped mountain in mythic geography, the place where the first Bon teacher descended from the heavens. And for Bon practitioners, the mountain is not merely sacred, but ancestral, the origin point of their spiritual lineage, making it a site of identity as well as devotion, and adding yet another layer of reverence that reinforces the idea that this mountain is not to be touched, altered, or dominated. Jainism, too, claims Kailash as Ashtapada, the place where the first Tirthankara, Rishabhanatha, attained liberation, and in Jain cosmology, the mountain is a place of ultimate release from the cycle of rebirth, a final threshold beyond which worldly striving ceases. And so, across 4 major religions, developed independently and across vast spans of time, the same mountain is repeatedly identified as a place where the human ends and the transcendent begins, a convergence so striking that it defies easy dismissal as coincidence, and instead suggests that something about the mountain's form, location, and presence spoke powerfully to the ancient imagination. The earliest historical references to the region come not from climbers, but from travelers and pilgrims, traders moving along the high-altitude routes that linked India, Central Asia, and the Tibetan Plateau, routes later romanticized as branches of the Silk Road. And these accounts consistently emphasize the remoteness and severity of the land, the thin air, the blinding light, the vast silence broken only by wind and prayer. And in these conditions, Mount Kailash loomed as a landmark both physical and spiritual, a point of orientation in a landscape that could easily disorient the body and the mind. And so it became a fixed point not just on the horizon, but in the cultural memory, a place known by reputation long before it was seen, its image carried in stories that magnified its mystery with each retelling. Chinese pilgrims such as Huanzang, who traveled to India in the 7th century in search of Buddhist texts, wrote of the sacred mountains of the western regions, and while Huanzang himself did not leave a detailed account of Kailash, later Chinese Buddhist literature places the mountain firmly within a sacred geography that extended beyond political borders, in reinforcing the idea that this was a place belonging not to any one kingdom, but to a spiritual world that transcended earthly rule. And in Tibetan chronicles, the mountain appears as a constant presence through centuries of shifting dynasties and conflicts, untouched by the rise and fall of kings, its sanctity serving as a stabilizing force in a volatile region. What is striking in all these early sources is not merely the reverence shown to the mountain, but the consistent absence of any attempt to climb it, an absence that itself is revealing, because ancient peoples were not universally afraid of mountains. They built fortresses on peaks, carved temples into cliffs, and crossed high passes in pursuit of trade and conquest. Yet Kailash remained inviolate, encircled with footpaths worn smooth by pilgrims, but rising above them untouched, its summit left alone not out of inability, but out of choice, a choice rooted in a worldview where certain boundaries were not meant to be crossed, where the sacred was protected by restraint rather than force. The act of circumambulation became the sanctioned way of engaging with the mountain, a ritual that allowed devotees to draw close without violating the sanctity of the peak, and this practice itself shaped the mythology as stories accumulated of miraculous events experienced along the Kora, of visions, sudden storms interpreted as signs, of pilgrims collapsing from exhaustion only to rise renewed, reinforcing the sense that the mountain was active, responsive, capable of blessing or warning those who approached with the wrong intent. And in this way, the mountain acquired a personality, a character that demanded respect. Over time, symbolic details gathered around Kailash that further distinguished it from ordinary peaks, such as the observation that its vertical rock faces appear to align with the cardinal directions, a feature that resonates strongly with cosmological symbolism in multiple traditions, and the striking striations on its southwest face that form a pattern resembling a swastika, an ancient symbol of auspiciousness and cosmic motion in Indian religions long before its appropriation in the modern era, a natural marking that pilgrims saw as a sign that the mountain itself bore sacred symbols, carved not by human hands, but by the forces of creation. And while geologists explain these features as the result of sedimentary layers and erosion, the emotional impact of seeing such forms in such a place cannot be separated from the interpretations they inspired. In the ancient imagination, the world was alive with meaning, and mountains were among their most eloquent speakers, and Kailash spoke in a voice that was at once commanding.
As the ancient world slowly gave way to the age of empires and exploration, the silence around Mount Kailash did not break so much as it deepened, because while the outside world began to measure, map, and categorize the earth with increasing confidence, this mountain remained wrapped in a protective aura of belief that even the most ambitious powers hesitated to disturb. And yet pressure was building, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as geopolitics, science, and imperial curiosity crept ever closer to the high plateau, bringing with them a fundamentally different way of seeing the land, one that valued data over devotion and conquest over contemplation. The expansion of the Tibetan Empire in the 7th to 9th centuries brought greater political organization to the region, but even as kings asserted control over vast territories, Mount Kailash remained a special status, its religious importance granting it a form of immunity that transcended royal authority. And Tibetan rulers, deeply embedded in Buddhist cosmology, saw themselves not as masters of the mountain, but as its guardians, patrons of the pilgrimage routes rather than proprietors of the peak. And this attitude would persist even as Tibet became a crossroads for competing influences from India, China, and Central Asia. When Islam spread across Central Asia and into parts of the western Himalayas, Muslim travelers and scholars heard of the mountain through local accounts, and while it did not occupy a central place in Islamic theology, it was nevertheless noted as a site of extraordinary reverence among the peoples of the region, a curiosity rather than a target. And so even new religious paradigms passing near its slopes left it untouched. The real shift began with the arrival of European powers in Asia, first as traders and missionaries, and later as imperial administrators and explorers, armed with instruments, maps, and a worldview shaped by the Enlightenment, which emphasized empirical observation and human mastery over nature. And it was in this context that Mount Kailash began to appear not only as a sacred site, but as an anomaly, a conspicuous blank spot in a rapidly filling map of the world. British interest in the Himalayas grew steadily during the 19th century as the British East India Company consolidated control over the Indian subcontinent and sought to understand the geography of its northern frontiers, both for strategic defense against rival empires like Russia and for the scientific prestige of exploration. And surveyors fanned out across the mountains, measuring peaks, tracing rivers, and naming summits. Yet Kailash remained frustratingly elusive, not because it was physically unreachable, but because political and cultural barriers made direct access difficult, and because even when British agents came close, they encountered a local population deeply opposed to any attempt to treat the mountain as an object of conquest. Early British explorers such as William Moorcroft and later Thomas Manning reached parts of western Tibet in the early 19th century and recorded observations of the region, but their accounts reflect a careful distance from Kailash itself, noting its importance while refraining from any attempt to approach it directly. And this restraint was partly pragmatic, as access to Tibet was tightly controlled, but it also reveals an awareness that violating local religious sensibilities could have serious consequences, both politically and personally. As the Great Game unfolded, the shadowy rivalry between the British and Russian empires for influence in Central Asia, Tibet took on heightened strategic importance. And yet, even in this atmosphere of espionage and brinkmanship, Mount Kailash was never proposed as a military objective or a point of leverage, its significance lying in a realm that imperial logic struggled to penetrate. And so it remained an outlier, a sacred island in a sea of geopolitical maneuvering. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked a turning point, however, as advances in mountaineering technology and the growing cultural prestige of climbing high peaks began to redefine mountains as arenas for human achievement, and the successful ascent of peaks like Mont Blanc and later the great summits of the Alps and Andes fed a narrative of progress that equated elevation with glory. And inevitably, attention turned toward the Himalayas, home to the highest mountains on Earth. And while Everest, K2, and others would eventually become icons of this new age, Kailash occupied an awkward position, because by every metric valued by modern climbers, it was not exceptional, standing at 6,638 meters, significantly lower than many nearby peaks. Yet it was precisely this fact that made its unclimbed status so intriguing, and to some suspicious. Scientific expeditions sponsored by European institutions began to penetrate deeper into Tibet in the early 20th century, often under the guise of cartography or ethnography, and figures such as Sven Hedin, the Swedish explorer and geographer, played a key role in bringing the region to the attention of the Western public. And Hedin, who traveled extensively in Central Asia and Tibet, came close to Kailash and documented its geography, but even he respected the prohibition against climbing it, later writing of the profound reverence with which the mountain was regarded and the hostility any attempt at ascent would provoke. And in doing so, he reinforced the idea that this was not merely a superstition, but a deeply ingrained cultural boundary. As geology developed as a scientific discipline, Kailash attracted interest for its unusual structure, composed primarily of sedimentary rock rather than the granite typical of many high peaks, suggesting a complex geological history involving ancient seabeds uplifted by tectonic forces. And scientists speculated about its formation, its striking symmetry, and its role as a watershed. Yet these questions were pursued from a distance, through observation and inference, because the summit itself remained off-limits. And this distance allowed speculation to flourish alongside science, blurring the line between rigorous inquiry and imaginative projection. By the mid-20th century, the political landscape of Tibet changed dramatically with the incorporation of the region into the People's Republic of China following the events of 1950, a transformation that reshaped governance, religious practice, and access. And many observers assumed that under a secular communist state, the religious taboos surrounding Mount Kailash would weaken, opening the door to scientific or even sporting expeditions. And for a brief moment it seemed possible that the mountain's isolation would end. Yet what followed was more complex, because while Chinese authorities asserted control over the region and regulated pilgrimage routes, they also recognized the immense symbolic importance of Kailash, both domestically and internationally, and understood that disturbing it could provoke unrest among Tibetan Buddhists, as well as Hindus and Jains in neighboring countries, making the mountain a sensitive issue in an already fraught geopolitical environment. During this period, rumors began to circulate in Western alternative literature and fringe theories that added new layers to the mountain's mystery, claims of hidden chambers, ancient technologies, and even extraterrestrial connections, often drawing on misinterpreted Buddhist texts or exaggerated reports from travelers. And while these ideas lacked credible evidence, they found an audience in a world increasingly fascinated by lost civilizations and forbidden knowledge. And the fact that Kailash remained unclimbed only fueled these speculations, turning absence of data into a canvas for imagination. One of the most persistent modern legends to emerge during this time was the claim that a Soviet expedition in the late 20th century sought permission to climb Mount Kailash and was denied, or climbers who approached the mountain experienced bizarre physical effects, including rapid aging or disorientation, stories that circulated widely but remain unsupported by verifiable sources. Yet their persistence speaks to a deeper cultural tension, a sense that Kailash resists rationalization, that it occupies a liminal space where the tools of modern science seem inadequate to fully explain its hold on the human psyche. What is documented, however, is that in 1985, the renowned mountaineer Reinhold Messner, the first person to climb all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks, reportedly considered the idea of climbing Mount Kailash, but ultimately rejected it, later stating that to climb the mountain would be to conquer something sacred, an act he felt would diminish both the climber and the mountain. And coming from a figure celebrated for pushing the limits of human endurance, this decision carried symbolic weight, suggesting that even within the culture of extreme mountaineering, there remained an awareness of boundaries that should not be crossed. Throughout the 20th century, as satellite imagery, aerial photography, and remote sensing technologies advanced, the physical mystery of Mount Kailash diminished in some respects, as its dimensions, geology, and surroundings became better understood. Yet paradoxically, its cultural and symbolic mystery only grew, because the more the world was mapped and measured, the more exceptional this untouched summit appeared, standing as a reminder that not every place had been absorbed into the narrative of human dominance. And this tension between knowing and not knowing, between access and restraint, would define the modern relationship with Kailash, setting the stage for a final chapter in which the mountain's future would be shaped by global politics, mass pilgrimage, environmental concerns, and an enduring question that no instrument could answer: whether some places are meant to remain beyond reach.
As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Mount Kailash entered the modern era not with conquest or revelation, but with a paradoxical intensification of its untouchability, because never before had so many eyes been able to see it, and so few hands been permitted to reach it. And this contradiction defines the final act of its story, unfolding in a world dominated by surveillance satellites, international diplomacy, mass tourism, and ideological conflict, yet still constrained by ancient belief. Under Chinese administration, the region around Mount Kailash was gradually opened to regulated pilgrimage and limited tourism. Roads were improved, permits formalized, and infrastructure expanded, allowing tens of thousands of pilgrims each year to perform the Kora, some walking, others prostrating themselves full length with every step, their bodies tracing devotion into the dust. And yet the summit itself remained forbidden, protected by an official ban on climbing that China has consistently upheld, citing respect for religious tradition. And while skeptics argue that this prohibition is also a convenient way to avoid logistical challenges and international scrutiny, the effect is the same. The mountain stands unclimbed, its peak as distant as ever, even as drones and high-resolution cameras capture every ridge and shadow. In this modern context, Mount Kailash has become a focal point for debates that extend far beyond mountaineering, touching on questions of cultural preservation, religious freedom, environmental ethics, and the limits of scientific inquiry. Because to climb the mountain would not merely be a physical act, but a symbolic rupture, an assertion that no place is beyond human reach. And for many, that assertion feels increasingly hollow in a world already strained by environmental degradation and cultural homogenization. The pilgrimage routes around Kailash have themselves become sites of tension, as increased foot traffic and commercialization threaten the fragile high-altitude ecosystem, prompting calls for stricter regulation and raising uncomfortable questions about how to balance access with preservation, devotion with sustainability. And in this sense, the mountain is no longer isolated from global concerns, but deeply enmeshed in them, its sanctity now defended not only by monks and pilgrims, but by environmentalists and policymakers who see in Kailash a rare example of restraint in an age of excess. At the same time, the myths surrounding the mountain have not faded under the glare of modernity, but adapted, finding new expression in digital media, documentaries, and online communities that frame Kailash as a nexus of unexplained phenomena, a place where time flows differently, where the laws of physics are bent, where ancient wisdom lies encoded in stone. And while historians and scientists dismiss such claims as speculation, their popularity reveals a persistent human hunger for mystery, a resistance to the idea that everything can be explained, categorized, and consumed. And in this way, Mount Kailash functions as a mirror, reflecting not only ancient beliefs, but modern anxieties about a world that feels increasingly stripped of wonder. Scientific studies conducted in the region have continued to shed light on its geology and climate, confirming that the mountain's shape, while striking, is the result of natural processes, and that reports of anomalous effects lack empirical support. Yet these findings coexist with a lived reality in which pilgrims describe profound psychological and emotional experiences, feelings of timelessness, clarity, and transformation that cannot be easily quantified. And here, the boundary between objective analysis and subjective meaning becomes clear, reminding us that not all truths are measured in data points, and that the power of a place can reside as much in human perception as in physical fact. The enduring refusal to climb Mount Kailash thus emerges not as a failure of courage or capability, but as a collective decision sustained across cultures, religions, and political systems to acknowledge a limit. And this decision stands in stark contrast to the dominant narrative of modern history, which celebrates the crossing of boundaries, the breaking of taboos, the relentless expansion of human reach. And perhaps it is precisely this contrast that gives Kailash its unique resonance today, as a symbol of restraint in a civilization defined by acceleration. For the people who live in its shadow, and for the millions who journey to its base, the mountain is not an unsolved puzzle waiting for an answer, but a presence to be encountered on its own terms. And in their rituals and stories, the question of why no one climbs it is less important than the understanding that some things lose their meaning when possessed. As climate change alters the Himalayan region, melting glaciers and shifting weather patterns, the rivers born near Kailash face uncertain futures, and with them the communities that depend on their waters, adding a layer of urgency to the mountain's story, because its role as a source of life is no longer a mythic abstraction, but a tangible reality at risk. And this environmental dimension reinforces the sense that Kailash is not merely a relic of the past, but a living participant in the present, its fate intertwined with global systems far beyond its isolated plateau. In the end, Mount Kailash remains what it has always been, a mountain that refuses to be reduced to a statistic or a trophy, a place where belief, history, and nature converge in a way that resists final explanation. And whether one sees it as the throne of gods, the center of the world, or simply a remarkable geological formation, its power lies in its ability to compel humility, to remind humanity that not every summit must be scaled, not every mystery solved, and that in choosing not to climb Mount Kailash, generation after generation has participated in a rare and fragile tradition, the preservation of the unknown, allowing the mountain to stand as a silent witness to the unfolding of history, untouched, unclaimed, and enduring, a testament to the idea that some boundaries once recognized become not obstacles, but anchors, holding meaning in place against the relentless tide of change.